All right guys, we're looking at a brand new product today. It's an 8-inch Dado stack from Sawstop. We're going to give it a full test and review and see how it stacks up against some of my favorites that I'm currently using in the wood shop. Stick around, we'll get into it. So we've got this brand new, nice clean Dado set, and we obviously can't have that, so let's open it up and take a look at it while it still looks halfway decent, and then let's get it a little dusty. We're going to test it on a 3 horsepower PCS Sawstop cabinet saw, and then we're also going to test it on a Laguna Fusion F2 table saw, just in case maybe you have a Sawstop or you don't, and you want to know how this particular blade might perform in your situation in a shop setting for you. We'll see if we can answer some of those questions. So let's first kind of do an unboxing where we just look at what you get, what the case looks like, what the blades look like, go over some of the specs there, and then we'll just get into a heavy test where we do a lot of cuts on 2 different styles of saws. Let's get going. So all the blades come in a nice blow molded case. They do have plastic latches on it, which initially I kind of wondered if these would hold up compared to like the metal latches that you get on the DeWalt 7670 case, but so far so good. I was glad to see that it had a case because many sets just leave you with a cardboard box, and that's always kind of been a frustration of mine. So you have a little threaded knob here, and that secures the outer blade, along with all of your chippers are on one stack here, compared to some cases that maybe store the chippers in the lid of the case. So that's just kind of the design you get here. So we have 24 tooth outer blades. The tooth geometry is a -5 hook angle, which is pretty standard fare with 24 teeth for a lot of the premium Dado sets that I've tested. And I think it's a good way to go. 24 outer teeth is high enough tooth count that you get pretty good cuts usually on hardwood joinery as well as plywood. 5/8 inch arbor. One thing Sawstop did is they put a little space here between the teeth. It almost makes it look like a combination blade, a 10-inch combination blade that you might run on your table saw, that type of look. Presumably just to give you a little more space to fit the chipper's teeth in and offset that so you're not carbide to carbide. So that's what the main blade looked like. You have 4 wing chippers here, which used to be kind of neat because most of these Dado blades originally would come with 2 wing chippers, and so when they started coming out with 4 wing chippers, hey, that was really an advantage. Now with the advent of 6 wing chippers, these kind of seem like standard fare, but they still cut pretty well. So you've got 1/8 inch chipper, here's a second 1/8 inch chipper, and then you get this big boy. You've got actually a 1/4 inch thick chipper, and I like that idea. Maybe a little quicker on setup time. So there's one of those. You got one thick chipper, and then what some sets forget to include are the undersized chippers. So we've got a 3/32 chipper there for a quick setup of undersized plywood. And then in the event that you can't hit your mark with the 3/32, they include the 1/16 inch chipper as well. So I think that's really good. And then your second outer blade. And looks like the case, wow, these are really wedged in here. So one thing I don't like to see is metal shims. There we go. So you almost have to bend your shims in half to get them out of there. Luckily they have the heavier ones on top. Okay, looks like we've got standard steel shims, which I generally don't like because they're good for about one use usually in my opinion. The problem is you get them up close and you tighten them on and they deform a little bit around the arbor threads. What I prefer is either plastic or magnetic shims because the plastic shims don't deform by the arbor threads, and the magnetic shims usually have an oversized hole. They just stay out of the way and they stick to your blade. So a little bit disappointed in 2 things on the shim: the fact that they're plain steel and the fact that they're not labeled. So I guess get your micrometer out to figure out what thickness shim you're adding. But these are kind of minor things so far. We'll test them out and see how they go. Maybe I'll change my opinion on that. But let's just quickly look at some of the other brands that I've been using recently. We'll do all of our testing on the Sawstop brand and see how it stacks up to the rest. So some of the other sets in my collection, the DeWalt 7670, 24 tooth outer blades and 4-wing chippers. The White Side Plus, little different design on that, 44 tooth outer blades and a more traditional 2-wing chipper. Ridge Carbide Dado Master, 24 tooth outer blades with a 4-wing chipper. And the one that I've long considered kind of the top dog, the Infinity Detonator with the impressive 6-wing chippers. 24 teeth on the outer blade and 6-wing chippers, along with what I feel is an improvement, the plastic shims. So those sets, among others, is where I'm coming from as I form opinions on this new Sawstop dado blade. So let's head over to the saws and start testing. We'll finish loading up the stack. We'll start with that extra wide 1/4 inch chipper. Slide that on. All right, for starters, we'll just make a groove with the grain in cabinet grade plywood. Cut looks nice and flat, even in a raking light. This is probably the least challenging test for a dado blade, just going with the grain in plywood. Sometimes the look of the plywood cuts depends more on what layer you've actually cut to. In the plywood, you go a little bit deeper, a little bit shallower, and the cut can look totally different. So just one word of warning when you're evaluating your own dado blade, just find a good layer where you can evaluate the blade and not the plywood. That looks good so far. We'll move on. The next cut we'll make is a cross grain cut in cabinet grade plywood. Okay, I'll turn you around. We can have a little look at the back side of the cut. And it looks like I've got just a couple little slivers off the back side of the cut. Pretty typical as far as that, nothing to worry about. So now we're looking at that middle groove. Let's have a look at the cut quality. And here you can see side by side. This one would have you think, oh, it's not doing very good, but it's just the layer we found. This one here, if we really evaluate it in raking light, we'll look to see if we can find any scoring lines. But now, interestingly, on that pass, I do see some light chip out on the veneer layer, where the first pass we did looked pretty good. This was a slightly deeper cut, so that can influence the quality of the cut. It did create some light chip out in cabinet grade plywood there. Looks like it could be pretty easily sanded out. The bottom of the cut, however, looks pretty flat. Within a 3/4 inch width, I don't see visible score lines, and there's nothing I can catch my thumbnail on, so pretty pleased with that so far. All right, now for the fun stuff. Let's get out some hardwood and try some joinery cuts. Let's see what we have with our cross grain cuts in hardwood walnut here. And so things I evaluate is, what does the scoring line look like when the cut is wider than a full 3/4 inch stack? Now that's always something I look at. It looks like there's a pair of pretty decent depth scoring lines. They might be, I don't know, 10 thousandths or so. But between the outer blades, just on a single pass, it looks like there's a nice flat cut. I'm not feeling any ridges there. Maybe one slight scoring line there. Pretty good overall. I would definitely rate that acceptable between a 3/4 inch. The lines on tenons wider than 3/4, those would be about average, I would say. The other thing I like to evaluate is corner sharpness, and this one looks very good. Very good. Just the lightest little bit of peach fuzz tear out on that. I'd still say that was good and very good. So overall, this would be fine to do hardwood joinery with walnut in this case. Even if your passes are wider than 3/4, you could probably sand out some of those imperfections if they were something that showed. All right, let's try a half lap joint. in maple. Okay, so looking at the cut quality of a half lap situation, looks like we have a tiny sliver of chip out on the one side. Entry side looks pretty good. You notice I was real careful when I'm doing these tests to pass the workpiece over the blade once, but not withdraw it past the blade again. And I think that gives you the cleanest possible cut. You'd see it if there was a little more backlight, but basically we're really flat within a 3/4 inch section. And then we have kind of those medium deep scoring lines when you get wider in a long tenon or half lap situation. Still what I would consider acceptable. And we'll do some riffs on white oak. So here's where the scoring lines get a little bit more prominent. I don't think it's the fact that it's riffs on white oak. That's a wood that mills pretty well. Instead, it was just a little bit wider than 2 passes could handle. So I had to hit it with a 3rd pass. And that's a situation I get into quite often when I'm cutting tenons for furniture projects. And that's just kind of the reality of it. You get 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 of the deeper scoring lines. And here maybe you can see the scoring lines that we're talking about. Pretty typical for a dado set. Of course they do that, make the outer blades slightly taller, just so that you don't run into too much chip out when you're doing veneer cuts. But the trade-off is when you're doing hardwood joinery, you do have some of the scoring lines. The other thing I've done is put a cross-grain dado here. We're going to test a with the grain groove, and we're actually going to cross that dado. And so we'll see if there's any splintering or issues as we cross that pre-existing groove. The dado blade seems to have passed that test. Again, this isn't the biggest test for a dado blade, but even in hardwoods, we're seeing flat bottom grooves. Just that little bit of scoring that's evident as you see the edge of the joint from the outer blades. This is a Fusion F2. I just wanted to test it on something that was sub 2 horsepower. Now when I installed this last outer blade the first time, I didn't really pay attention to where the extra space was. I'm used to just putting the blades on wherever they fit between the teeth, and you can do that, but because they've kind of bunched these teeth together and then given you more space in certain spots, with this particular blade it probably makes sense to put the chipper teeth in that larger space. Actually a decent amount of exit chip out on that one. I'm never sure whether to blame the plywood or the blade with that. Of course, a groove like this, it's not a backed up cut. But as far as the flatness of the groove, it's nice and flat again, no complaints there. We came across an internal knot in the plywood, but as far as the flatness of the bottom of the groove, looks good. So I did my very best to replicate those exact same cuts on the Fusion F2 saw. In fact, I used the other end of the same board, so there was no differences between wood species or just kind of a ratty piece of wood that would affect the cut quality. So we've ruled out those sorts of problems, and in fact, going to the Fusion F2 versus the Sawstop, I didn't notice any difference in the cut quality. Everything I noticed on the Sawstop cuts, it was very similar on the Fusion F2. So just quickly, how do all these dado stacks rate? And if we look at them in terms of the number of teeth on the chipper, we would expect the 2-wing chipper sets to be kind of the bottom of the premium set in this case, and the middle of the premium set would be your 4-wing chippers. The best of the best tend to be the 6-wing chippers. If you imagine just having one tooth spinning around on a chipper, you could see that you would get a lot of chip out, a lot of exit blowout. And so just take that and extrapolate it out. The more teeth you have on the chippers, typically, the better you're going to do with hardwood joinery, especially when your cuts are across the grain. Now, let's see how that theory panned out. If we looked at the Ridge Carbide set, 4-wing chippers, we would expect it to be middle of the pack among premium sets. That's exactly how that set performed. Look at a set like the Whiteside Plus. Okay, it has high tooth count on the outer blades, but it's still just using 2-wing chippers. I would expect that to perform on the low end of this particular set of dado blades. It actually exceeded expectations. I would put it in the middle of the pack among premium sets, even though it only has 2-wing chippers. Let's look at a set like the DeWalt 7670. In that case, 4-wing chippers, I would expect it to be middle of the pack among premium sets. That's exactly where that lands. Cream of the crop, I would say, would be Infinity Datonator. It's got 6-wing chippers. I would expect it to perform at the best, and it actually does, especially in difficult situations like hardwoods that are prone to chip out, like ash and oak, and especially in cross-grain situations when you're trying to make dados, notches, hardwood joinery. So that's where that one lands. But hey, where does this Sawstop set fit into the mix? 4-wing chippers, we would expect it to be middle of the pack among premium dado sets, and it actually outperformed expectations by a bit. We noticed nice flat bottom cuts. The scoring lines from the outer blades were a little bit deeper than I like, and I'm not a huge fan of the plain steel shims. Also, I did have some trouble installing and removing the shims from the case, but I do give them points for including a nice blow molded case with it. We'll see how that holds up, both the blade and the case over time, and we will do a long-term review once we get some mileage on the set. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.